Right. Good morning. Good morning. Nobody? Nobody. Good morning. There we go. There's a good morning. All right. This morning we are going to look at 1 Peter chapter 2 again, and we're going to look at the um, first couple things that Peter gives as direct sort of commands for us to do as a result of us being the special people that's chosen. It's chosen special people. We need to remember though what First Peter is. It's a letter. It was a circular letter. It was written to multiple churches, designed to be passed around, right? In this Roman province that was called Asia Minor, right? Which is most of what we would call modern day Turkey. And Peter had learned that these Christians, these mostly non-Jewish Christians, I should say, were being persecuted. Put that away. That is not church related. Thank you. They're being persecuted, right? They were facing hostility and harassment. We don't find out until a little bit later in the book that this is sort of what's going on. But it was coming from their Greek and their Roman neighbors, right? So Peter writes to encourage them in the midst of their suffering, right? And that sort of is going to outline the frame of the main design and themes of this letter that we have here. And so Peter began in chapter 1 with a greeting to these churches, to those who reside as aliens scattered throughout these regions, who are aliens, he says, it's also the same word, exiles, who are living around the world. And he's gonna make it very clear to these Christians who are ethnically Gentiles, who are ethnically non-Jews, right? He says in chapter 1, verse 14 and verse 18. Peter is going to describe them, though, with the same phrases that were used of ethnic Israel in the Old Testament, about God choosing Israel, right? From Genesis 18 and Isaiah 41. Peter's now going to call them with the same words that were used from the family that came from Abraham. Abraham, who himself was an exile and a wanderer, right? Genesis chapter 23 and verse 4. And so Peter is going to show them that they have a new family identity. They are no longer just Gentiles. They are the family of Abraham now. That they are Israel, this church, these believers in Christ who were not Jews before, didn't become Jews when they became Israel, but they became Christians who are now the promise, the fulfillment of the promise that was made to Israel. And so that strategy is, let me back up. So Peter uses that method, though, of using Old Testament terms and applying it to these Gentiles. And that has a way of focusing their future hopes on the return of Jesus, right? Because it's only through Jesus that they can attain this new status, right? But that's going to focus their future hope now on the return of Jesus. And that is all of what his second letter is all about. 2 Peter is about talking about the return of Jesus. And that strategy of focusing on Jesus and their future hopes on Jesus is something that Peter is going to repeat throughout his entire letter. He wants those Gentile Christians that are suffering to see that through Jesus, they now belong to the family of Abraham. They have been grafted in. They have been adopted in. They are exiles and wanderers now, just like Abraham was, just like their spiritual ancestors were in the desert, wandering through out of Egypt. They will most likely be misunderstood and mistreated as they wait for that true homeland that is promised to them. The new Jerusalem, the new heavens, the new earth. And so within chapter 1 there, let's talk about what happened in chapter 1. We can find that idea of looking forward to the future there as giving them hope in that opening sort of poem or song that he gives in verses 3 through 12. Right? Peter is going to praise God for causing the people to be born again into a living hope through Jesus' resurrection. It's through his resurrection that we can have that same living hope. And we can have that same power of the Spirit that raised Jesus up from the dead. Jesus gives us that same powerful Spirit. And so now God is going to invite everyone in the world, all of his images, all of his creations, into this new family that is going to be centered around Jesus. And this new family has a new identity, right? That new identity as God's specially chosen, specially loved children. And these children have this new hope of a world that's going to be reborn by God's love when Jesus returns as King to stay with us forever. And so for people who have that hope, suffering and persecution is kind of like a weird gift. Right? Suffering burns away like fire on gold. It burns away false hopes. It burns away impurities that are inside of us. It burns away distractions and false hopes. And like that gold, it purifies us. It reminds us of our true home and our true hope. And so it's kind of like a paradox, right? That that hardship in life can actually deepen our faith. And sometimes it can make our faith more genuine. From that point, Peter's going to move on now to the body of the letter that is going to explore those ideas more deeply. Right? We're going to move now into suffering as this witness for Jesus, or to Jesus because of our suffering. So 3 weeks ago, maybe 4, we saw Peter first give us that theme of their new family identity by he takes these very memorable Old Testament images about the family of Israel, both when they're wandering through the desert and in Isaiah and those sorts of things. And he applies them to the Gentile Christians. He applies those metaphors to the Gentile Christians. They are like the Israelites who left Egypt. They should gird up their loins, he says in chapter 1, verse 13. Right? That's similar to Exodus chapter 12. And they should leave their former life behind on their way to the new future. They are a holy people, right? The holy people of God journeying through this new wilderness. That's chapter 1 in Peter, verse 15 and 16. And that's going to correspond with Leviticus, chapter 11 and verse 44. They are a people of this new exodus coming out of the slavery to the world, to the Roman Empire, to the people around them, to their former desires. They're coming out of that exodus and have become a new people who are redeemed by the blood of Jesus. Jesus, who is this ultimate Passover lamb, which is one of the defining characteristics of them coming out of Egypt in Exodus chapter 12 through 15. They are the people of the new covenant that God has made with them, who have this word that is buried down inside of them, deep down inside of them, that restores their hearts and their minds. And of course, that's a direct reference to Jeremiah 31:31 and Isaiah chapter 40. And finally, last week, we saw that they are the new temple that is built on the foundation of Jesus himself. That they are the new kingdom of priests who are living stones who serve God as representatives to the nations. That Jesus has built this new temple, and he's building it out of us, the people, these living stones. And by applying all of those images, those Old Testament images, to these Gentile Christians, Peter places their suffering, he puts their suffering in the category within the context of a new story. And that leads to where we're coming up today. We're starting a new section in the book. 1 Peter chapter 2, and verse 11 through almost the end of the book. Chapter 4 and verse 11 is sort of all one big section. And it shows how their persecution can actually help clarify their mission in the world. And let me say that for us using different verbs. Peter tells us how our hardship in life, how our persecution can actually help clarify our mission in the world. We are called to bear witness to God's mercy among the many nations around us. And that's what Peter wants us to do. We started off, of course, chapter 1, verse 1 talks about God's elect being these exiles, right? And so throughout 1 Peter, we've seen them as being pilgrims and exiles and wanderers. There's lots of different translations for those words. That those Christians, or those people who are Christians, they have many blessings and many responsibilities. And for example, last week we saw that they were pilgrims and sojourners, or exiles and sojourners. And so we're supposed to have our conduct, Sophia, you put it down. Thank you. We need to have our conduct honorable among those people that we live with, among the Gentiles that we live around, those non-Christians that we live around. But what about our responsibility to the government that we live under? What's our responsibility there? Well, Peter has already told us that our true citizenship, right, is in that heavenly city, that new Jerusalem, that new heavens, that new earth. So, do we have any responsibility to the federal government here on earth? Yeah, that's his very first item on the list, right? The very first item on the list of this, how our morality comes out publicly, is our relationship to the government, our relationship to the state. And he's going to make a very similar point to the point that he makes in Romans chapter 13, or that Paul makes, I should say, in Romans chapter 13, right? Peter is going to command them to submit to Roman rule even when it is oppressive. That same lesson is for us. You need to submit to the United States federal government even when it is oppressive to you. That's a difficult thing to think about, right? Because we're America, the land of the free. We don't submit to anyone, right? Let's go through. Let's read 1 Peter chapter 2, starting in verse 11. I'll read through verse 17. Beloved, I urge you as aliens and strangers, or exiles and strangers, to abstain from fleshly lusts which wage war against the soul. Keep your behavior excellent among the Gentiles, so that in the thing in which they slander you as evildoers, they may, on account of your good deeds, as they observe them, glorify God in the day of visitation, or the day of Christ's coming again in his judgment. Very first rule he gives, very first thing he tells you to do. What's your duty as a citizen of this new heavenly nation? What is your first duty? Your first duty is to submit yourself for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether to a king as one to authority, or to governors as sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do right. The very first thing you're supposed to do is submit yourself. As a pilgrim and a sojourner, as an exile, as an alien and a sojourner, we're supposed to have conduct that is honorable among those people that we live. The word here, ordinance, or I think it says here, every human institution, literally means a creation, right? A creation. The Greek and the Romans, especially in their military structures, did not say, we promoted this person to an officer. What they said was, we created an officer out of this person. And so this word has sort of military associations with it. To every human creation, everything that was made out of this human institution. And so they described how they appointed these officers in the military as the creation of them. So the expression of the ordinance here, every human ordinance or every human creation, is not to a particular law that is passed by a particular government. That's not what that means. That's what ordinance means to us, right? We have city ordinances. That's not what this means. This is every human creation. This is submitting to the civil government as an institution itself. I think the New American Standard translates it very accurately. It says, you need to submit yourself to every human institution. And I think we also need to take note that we're supposed to submit to every human institution, whether it's a representative republic, a monarchy, democracy, or even the totalitarian government, right? The pilgrim, the exile's duty is the same. Our duty is the same. Our duty is to submit. Oh, there. Over here. Yep. Our duty is to submit. So, Peter is going to specifically highlight the very difficult situation now of a specific subgroup of people who are supposed to submit to the state. Right? Verse 13, submit yourself for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether to a king as to one in authority, or governors sent by him for punishment of the evildoers and the praise of those who do right. For such is the will of God, that by doing right you may silence ignorance and foolish men. Act as free men, and do not use your freedom as a covering for evil, but use it as bond slaves. Use it as servants of God. Honor all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. If you'll notice, honor there is there twice. And we'll get to that a little bit on the next slide. We'll talk about how that's a chiasm. But I want to point out the second group of people here that Peter points out. And he's pointing to master-slave relationships. Now, we don't necessarily have that same sort of relationship today, but we have a similar sort of relationship with our employer. And not just our employer, but also, I think Peter's talking to the wives here, people who are seen by the society as being lower class, right? So Peter's going to highlight the very difficult situation that Christian slaves and wives faced, because when you're a Christian in a Roman household, right, and the patriarch of this household doesn't follow Jesus, there's a problem. And the problem was that that Roman patriarch expected everyone in the household to submit and to worship to his gods, right, whichever one he chose. And so Peter is aware that giving allegiance to Jesus is going to generate suspicion. And so Peter says it's true. All Christians, including Roman wives and slaves, they have been fully liberated by Jesus. They are on the same level as the master in God's eyes. But they are supposed to demonstrate that freedom. They're supposed to demonstrate that freedom that they have, not through rebellion, but by showing love and generosity to their enemies. That's the upside down kingdom of Jesus, right? They are supposed to demonstrate their freedom, not through rebellion, but by resisting evil the same way Jesus did, through showing love and generosity to your enemies. They're supposed to resist evil the same way Jesus did, through showing love and generosity to their enemies, right? And so these rulers are supposed to be honored, he says now in verse 17. Honor all men. But Peter's going to nuance his command here as he sort of carefully as he's summing up his command on the government. And what we find here is two double statements in verse 17. Honor all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. So there's this two pairs of things that are bound together by honor. And if we'll, excuse me, well, if you'll notice, they'll make a pattern of what we call a chiasm, or a chiastic pattern of A, B, B, A. And the first pair is honor everyone, love the brotherhood, love your fellow Christians. Not just the king, but every human being is due honor, Peter says. From the noble to the slave, right? All are going to be created, all have been created in the image of God. That's James chapter 3. And that's in contrast, right, to who are to be honored. Sorry, this is in contrast to non-Christians who are to be honored. Fellow non-Christians are to be honored, but fellow Christians are to be loved. So there is this connection between the two groups, that everyone deserves honor, but there is a contrast as well, that Christians are to be loved. Fellow Christians are to be loved. You see, in the New Testament, as we read through it, it's sort of aware that the church, and I use that term sparingly now because Peter doesn't use that term at all here in the book. He uses the household of God, the people of God, those sorts of things. Peter doesn't use the word church. The New Testament, though, as we read through it and we talk about the church, and the church as being our family, as being brothers and sisters, Adelphos and Philadelphia, and all those brotherly love terms, there's a call to love other Christians in a way that we don't love anybody else. There is a special love there. Peter has made sort of a change, though, from this sort of language. He makes it clear that not only God is supposed to be reverenced or feared, because God alone is ultimate, right? Uh, Even non-Christians sort of shared that belief during that time period. And they honored Caesar as divine, or at least semi-divine. Peter's going to end here this sort of section on a lower note when he says, honor the king. Remember, he just said honor everyone, and now honor the king. So Caesar has been brought down to the level of everyone, but we still need to honor him because he realized that and was aware of the fact that God controlled history, and he uses various pagan pagan rulers to do his will. And it was that balance, the balance of God using pagan rulers to do his will, that made the church in the next few centuries refuse to take part in any of the revolutions that happened. I don't know if you remember, but from AD 66 to AD 70, all of the Christians fled Jerusalem. They fled rather than taking part in this revolution that ultimately failed. This belief in God using pagan rulers to do his will is what led to the church's refusal to take part in the army of Rome, to voluntarily take part in the army of Rome. And if you read any sort of church writing from this sort of period, they speak respectfully and appreciatively, actually, of the Roman government. But they also refuse to even give a pinch of incense to Caesar in worship. You realize that giving a pinch of incense to Caesar was essentially the same thing as saluting the flag in our United States. It was giving honor to the king and the primary symbol of the empire. This was the same thing as saluting the flag in the United States. This was this sort of truth, the fact that God uses non-believers to do his will, and that we have to suffer through that sometimes. That was the truth that Christians were supposed to bring out and teach to the world. So let's sort of bring this all together now. Last time, Peter asked us to be more like Jesus, right? To keep away from the fleshly desires that do battle against our soul. He asked us to maintain good conduct among the non-Christians, among the Gentiles. And by doing that, Peter is hopeful that this imitation of Jesus' love, of showing the world his upside-down kingdom, that by doing that, that will give power to their words as we bear witness to God's mercy. You see how I changed the pronouns there? Now I'm talking about us, right? Peter gives us the power. He gives us the power to bear witness to God's mercy and to show people the beautiful truth about that way of Jesus, the way of following Jesus. But Peter is also a realist, I would say, right? He knows that Christians are going to continue to be persecuted. And so he reminds them of their future vindication, right? Peter reminds us of how Jesus himself was unfairly persecuted, right? How he was murdered by corrupt men who were in power. Corrupt human powers murdered Jesus. But in reality, that's what happened, right? But the reality, the truth of the situation was that he was dying for the sins of his enemies. And afterward, Jesus was vindicated and given the resurrection back to life by the Spirit. The same Spirit that we have. That we have the Spirit in us now if we will commit ourselves to him. If we will put our faith in Jesus. If we will put our trust in him. We can have that same Spirit. Because Jesus specifically sent it to comfort us. Right now, the risen Jesus is living as exalted king over all of those spiritual powers that we talked about this morning in the class. Remember the divine council we talked about? Jesus is king over all of those powers. He's also king over all the human powers. Next week, we're going to look at how Peter shows us, or we should look at the fact that Peter shows us how baptism points to the vindication of Jesus' followers. Like Noah, they have been saved through the waters, not as some sort of magic ritual, but as this sacred symbol that shows their change of heart. It joins them to Jesus. Baptism joins them to Jesus in his death and in his resurrection as we come out of the waters and become a new person. That's the message for this week in 1 Peter chapter 2. Next week, we'll look at the rest of chapter 2 and get into chapter 3. I actually don't think we'll get quite to the baptism part next week, but we might. That's the lesson for today. We'll look forward to seeing everybody here next week.